But the Obama administration has been very supportive, and clearly DOL, the Department of Labor, has found that participation in self-employment has been cost effective. It's significantly increased total employment and total earnings by the folks who participated. Part of its success comes to my mind from the fact that while folks got unemployment, workers in self-employment assistance also participated in programs that provided technical assistance and capacity building skills to run a successful small business. And I think that was one of the kind of big factors. I mean, nobody ought to operate under the theory that a bunch of people on Capitol Hill and Bob and I and others who have been for this are going to say that every person can take a part of their unemployment check and suddenly go out and start a biotechnology company. I mean, I just want to kind of inject a note of realism in this. But having done that, I think it's also important for people to talk about some of the examples and some of the ways in which this is really paying off. And I just give you an example of one of my constituents. He was part of the C program. He was 47 years old and had for some time been making a good living selling appliances. He was making in the vicinity of $60,000. He was laid off when the economy dipped shortly after completing his associate's degree. He had to spend 6 years getting that degree because he could only go to classes part-time, but he just kept staying at it, plugging away, and he got it. When he got laid off, he's looking at his situation, and because he's from Oregon, where we feel strongly about energy efficiency, he made a judgment, that's going to grow. That's going to really take off. People are going to spend some time on this. And of course, he made exactly the right call. So rather than applying for traditional unemployment compensation, he enrolled in the C program. He borrowed a little bit of money from anybody that he could find in his little circle and started his own energy audit business. Today, he has trained over 40 energy auditors. He's got contracts with a whole host of folks, community colleges, and he is sort of a model, in my view, of the kind of person who, if we think through safety net programs in the future, we can do a lot more with. This is not a question of precluding the traditional network of social safety net services. This is a question of whether we want to create more opportunities and, as I've come to characterize it, a kind of trampoline into entrepreneurship, which I think is particularly promising. So not all states have been willing to do what we've done in Oregon. I'm going to introduce legislation shortly with Bob's good counsel to expand the program to all states, ensure that they have the resources and the assistance they need to get the program off the ground. And in my view, this is sort of part and parcel of what we ought to be doing to spur innovation in our country, build on the strengths of American workers who have skills, who have been laid off through no fault of their own, such as this individual I've described, who was pretty much sitting there in paradise, beautiful Oregon, having worked in the appliance sector, and through no fault of his own, his life disappeared out from under him with no way to support himself, and we were able to use this program to give him another future. Let me mention one other issue, and then whatever Bob's leave is, we can take questions. Softball questions are always welcome on Friday afternoon. I do think that it's important to touch on the issue of tax policy. And as you know, there's been a little bit of discussion here in Washington, D.C. Last couple of weeks about taxes. And most of this involves a really heated debate between the idea of reenacting George W. Bush's tax policy or going forward with the proposals of Barack Obama. And we had a hearing yesterday about tax reform in the Senate Finance Committee, on which I serve, and I just offer up the idea, particularly to a group advocating, entrepreneurship, that in my view, this is the wrong debate to be having right now. This idea of comparing whether to reenact the Bush, tax, reform, the Bush tax, proposals of 2001 and 2008, or the Obama proposals. The reason I feel that way is both approaches would take today's broken, discredited, and anti-entrepreneur tax system and write it into stone. If you want to sign up for the thousands and thousands of pages that make up the American tax system and spend the hours and hours every spring, with your software and your, tax preparers, then go do that and take one of those two approaches. But I don't think that's in the interests of entrepreneurs. I don't think it's in the interests of our country. And so I have, with Senator Judd Gregg of New Hampshire, introduced the first bipartisan tax reform bill in a quarter century, and it's built around the idea that we ought to have a simpler system, which is particularly important for entrepreneurs. So we have a one-page 1040 form, folks, 29 lines long, something human beings could actually fill out. What a radical notion for American, taxes. Get rid of the alternative minimum tax, triple the standard deduction, make it possible for small businesses, for entrepreneurs to write off the cost of a new piece of equipment right away. Tax simplification, lower rates, and rates that are not paid for, rate reductions not paid for by increasing the deficit, but paid for by getting rid of some of these outrageous loopholes that have been stuffed into the code by special interest groups who've got just enough juice to go out and hire a lobbyist who convinces people on the Senate Finance Committee that Western civilization is going to end if they don't get another tax break. That's how we pay for tax reform. And guess what? We did this once before. Back in the 80s, President Ronald Reagan got together with a whole bunch of Democrats and did just this. And if you compare job growth and payroll growth between those years in the 80s to the years of 2001 and 2008, it's not even close, folks. We ought to say, let's go back to what was done in the 80s when Democrats and Republicans got together, rather than to reenact 2001 and 2008. So the adequate comparison, if we're really going to do some comparison on the taxes, should not be George W. Bush against Barack Obama. The real comparison should be what was done in the 80s when Ronald Reagan and the Democrats got together against what happened during the Bush years, 2001 and 2008. And the data is very clear, very, very clear, that working in a bipartisan way to make the tax code simpler and fairer and more pro-growth will be a boon to entrepreneurs, a boon to small businesses, a boon to our country. And instead of having a lot of these petty partisan, battles, Democrats and Republicans could go after what they really ought to be going after, the special interest groups that have hijacked our tax code. You're wonderful to have me. Bob is on his feet, which means I ought to be off mine. And I just so appreciate the chance to be with you. Look forward to doing a lot of work with you in the days ahead. Thank you.
I do want to present a 2010 Assets Policy Champion Award to Senator Ron Wyden.